and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin in the U.S., where thousands across the country protested on the streets over the weekend against one of the nation's most restrictive abortion bans in decades. States like Alabama and Missouri are rushing to become the latest to overturn abortion rights, drawing fire from women activists and setting off an intense partisan and legal fight. Have these bills gone too far in reshaping women's fundamental rights to abortion? Before we get down to our discussion, take a look at this.
Fierce opposition on the ground in Alabama, now sweeping across the U.S. The Alabama governor signed into law America's most restrictive abortion ban, essentially a total ban on abortion at any stage of pregnancy, with only exceptions for serious health risks, but not for rape or incest. Doctors who violate the ban could face 99 years in prison.
If it's between a doctor and a woman, and it's in her best interest to get an abortion, she should be able to do that.
That's absolutely going to impact the way physicians decide to practice medicine. If they're in fear of going to jail for the rest of their lives, that decision to save a woman's life is going to become more complicated, and I fear that women are going to suffer.
Coming on the heels of the Alabama bill, Missouri also passed a bill to outlaw abortions after 8 weeks of pregnancy last week. 8 states have so far passed sweeping restrictions on abortion this year, seeking to narrow abortion rights, sparking impassioned backlash across the U.S. U.S. President Donald Trump, seen by many as a hardliner on abortion, outlined a less restrictive view on abortion, saying he favors making an exception on cases of rape and incest. The Alabama bill will take effect in November, but it will likely face legal challenges. All of the 25 lawmakers who voted in favor of the ban are all male Republicans, something not lost on many who think abortions affect women too intimately for the state to intervene.
So is the U.S. headed for a fierce national debate and legal showdown over abortion rights? Let's loop in our panelists in our Beijing studio. He Wenping, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, welcome, man. Also here, Einar Tangen, who is a current affairs commentator. He used to serve on the legal state board of the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And also, we are joined in Washington, D.C., Brandon Andrews, entrepreneurial and former Capitol Hill staffer. Welcome. To you first, Mr. Andrews. Tell me about exactly what is the nature of this debate. Why this time?
Well, Tian, I actually grew up in the state of Alabama. I was raised there by my grandmother. She was a teacher. She also went to church several times a week and took me with her. So I'm very familiar with the moral value system that's driving many of these legislators, Christian or otherwise, who voted for this bill in Alabama. But make no mistake about it, this is playing out in Alabama, but this is part of a decades-long strategy by national Republicans to challenge Roe versus Wade. National Republicans have used Roe versus Wade to animate the grassroots. For the past few decades, they've used it to win races in state houses and gain majorities, to gain governorships, which have helped Republicans compete nationally. When Donald Trump, who was a controversial candidate, won the nomination, many Republicans said, hey, he may have said racist and sexist things, but if he gets into office, he'll have a chance to get some Supreme Court justices in there that can challenge Roe versus Wade. And of course, as we've seen with Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, again, Roe versus Wade to animate the grassroots for support there. So It's been really interesting to see national Republicans back away from this Alabama bill. Everyone from the RNC chair, Ms. McDaniels, all the way down have really panned this bill. And even Richard Shelby, who is the senior senator from the state of Alabama, he dithered and said, well, it's up to the courts when asked on camera about this abortion bill, and literally ran into an elevator to keep from having this conversation.
Okay.
The key thing that I think national Republicans understand is that Americans have been fairly consistent in terms of not wanting to overturn this for the past 20 years or so. And so it'll be really interesting as 2020 comes up to see, does this pro-life monster, so to speak, that Republicans have created actually eat their chances of making some progress.
Of course, you're analyzing from a political perspective with the upcoming election. We're going to talk a little bit about that a bit later. I want to correct earlier how I introduced you. Einar, you've been serving at the Civil Liberty Board of the state of Wisconsin before you are coming to China. So, of course, the state of Wisconsin is a very different state compared to where Mr. Andrews coming from, Alabama. So let me ask you about that. How do you see why the issue has become such a big issue now, besides what's going on with the Supreme Court?
Well, I mean, there's a number of ways that you have to look at the abortion debate, from, especially in a purple state. That's what we described. It can go either red or blue. What you have is 48% pretty evenly who are pro-life or pro-choice. That's how they identify them. When it comes to Roe versus Wade, 60% say, no, we don't want to overturn it. And 77% of the people say that that abortion should be allowed in the case of rape and incest. So you have some indicators there, but as a political issue, this is an emotional one. This is what stirs people up. And for Donald Trump's base, this is a very, very important. They have told him in no uncertain terms they want it, which is why it was surprising that he came out with a statement from the White House, from the Rose Garden, saying, no, rape and incest should be included in.
Yeah. Well, of course, this is controversial political issues for decades, but one of the things people really want to know is the three states, Mr. Andrews, Alabama, Georgia, and also, let's see, with Missouri. The three states seem to be standing out, but of course, within the three states, there are also those who have very different views, even among the Republican supporters. So will this be also a dividing issue within the party itself? That's also an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think folks at the grassroots who have been working literally for decades to bring a significant challenge to Roe versus Wade aren't going to want anything but a challenge to Roe versus Wade and conservative justices on the Supreme Court to vote to overturn it. I don't think they're going to take any medium or any other solution here, but that's going to, as the other guest said, bump up against, generally speaking, Americans being okay with Roe versus Wade, and definitely Americans being completely fine, almost completely fine with, in instances of rape or incest, abortion being allowed. And so I think within the Republican Party, there's going to be a really significant struggle here. There's going to be some friction between national Republicans who want to win in 2020 and make progress both in the Senate and then also with the presidency, and grassroots Republicans who have been doing this work for decades who want nothing less than an overturning of Roe versus Wade with these new conservative justices. So yeah, definitely some friction coming within the party.
Right, but what about for the Democratic Party? There are already quite a lineup of the Democrat candidates over there, Mr. Tangen. Will this also be a big win issue for the Democrats, though?
It depends on how it's playing. As I was explaining earlier, in terms of statistics, if you say that the Republicans are saying that you can't have an abortion if you've been raped or or it's an incest, people will react strongly to it. But if it's put in pro-choice versus pro-life terms, it's going to be 50-50. So it's kind of not as big a hot button. Now for women,
really?
No, for women though, across the board, this is a big, big issue, and it's been driving a lot of the politics. There's political groups called Emily's List, and they're very, very interested not only in women candidates, but women candidates who are supporting women's right to choose for their own body.
However, when you say the Democratic Party might not be necessarily having that strong an opinion about that, I really wonder about it, because there are already quite a number of analysts suggesting that the Democratic Party candidates are likely having a uniform view almost about the Roe versus Wade rather than the other way around.
No, I'm not saying that the Democrats...
So what exactly you meant?
No, what I meant is it depends on how they present it on the campaign trail. If it's a unified body, I mean a unified statement, a plank in the party platform where they're saying, look, this is where we stand, and they're able to put it in terms of, you know, the Republicans don't even believe in a woman's right to choose when she's been raped or the victim of incest. Then they can win, because then you start talking about 77% of the people reacting very positively to their message, very negatively to Republican.
Of course, Ms. He, you've been attentively listening to your two other colleagues when they analyze the situation from their own perspective. You are Chinese. We are not interfere in others' internal affairs, but certainly this is a very fired up issue, shall we say, as we observe the United States from afar. As a woman here in China, what do you make of this debate apparently going on inside the U.S. society and the apparent divide, at least, that you see among many from different states?
Yeah, apart from those political consideration, just to look about this issue from a women's perspective, I think I feel quite outraged as well from this Alabama, this abortion law, because it's totally, I think, not considering those women's rights by themselves. Because as you said, this is a women's body, and then this should be their own choice. So no matter it's talking about the pro like life or pro the choice, I think you have to first of all considering the rights of that pregnant women, the people, because this is their body. They have the the every right to make the decision about how to handle it. Secondly, I think the reason, because now I have a very strong interest in to notice President Trump's the statement. He wants to combine the two different opinions, mix them together. So this is totally reflects those politicians, their point of view. They have no clear this kind of moral stance by themselves. Back to the years ago, he has different opinion, but now becoming campaign time, and he has another opinion. Now he asked for the 2020 re-election, and then he wants to mix them together, saying, "Oh, I pro-life," and then this is asked for those a group of voters, because those voters fully against this abortion rights to the woman. And then he said, oh, another three exceptions, like those rape, like incest, and also dangers to the mother's health. So they want to get another kinds of vote.
Right.
So this issue actually is simple, but when it combined with those political issues, and then becoming complex.
Mr. Andrews, many looking at the issue from afar really wonder about the dramatic changes going on in the American society. Of course, Roe versus Wade, you have seen that issue being hanging over there for decades, but has never been in such a scale since the debates become so fired up inside the U.S. society. Meanwhile, many wonder whether the 60s and 70s, the histories that U.S. experienced then, is likely to be repeated in a very different way, which means social debates become such a hot button of American society, whether it's wealth gap, whether it's education, whether it's racial issues, whether it's women's rights, or in other forms. Mr. Andrews, your thought?
Yeah, well, there are few things, Tien, that people are more passionate about than the lives of their children, than their families. And so, given that, you can understand the passion that you see. And so, yeah, I fully expect to see movements, marches, protests, both online and in person here in Washington, D.C. and across the country on both sides of this issue. It is coming to a head again because these new conservative justices are on the Supreme Court, and there's a real possibility, given their history, that Roe versus Wade could be overturned. So you're going to see both sides of this issue animate and organize and advocate for what they want to get out of this. And I think to speak to your question more broadly, we have this dialectical construct for our public discourse, where we have thesis and antithesis, and it's supposed to lead us to a higher synthesis. But I think what often happens is that dialectical construct drives a wedge and sends people to their corners. And so in the case of abortion, you have folks on the left saying Republicans are trying to control women's bodies, and you have folks on the right saying that Democrats are trying to kill babies, and neither one of those points is a good place to begin a conversation. This is a very complicated issue. It's an issue that people are very passionate about, but we've got to make sure that as we're having the discourse, that we're actually looking to a synthesis, that we're looking to some kind of consensus versus just standing in each other's corners and shouting at each other, because that's not going to lead to the kind of change that people want to see.
Mr. Tangut.
Look, it's very hard for people in the United States to understand that a woman has a right to choose. It's her body. All right, and I hold that principle. I was on the board of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and we did. Now, in this particular case, you have to start looking at what they've done. They have not criminalized the abortion itself. All right, the woman can get an abortion. They have criminalized those who provide abortions. So they're going directly at the doctors. So they're going to try to use a different legal theory when they go to the things. Now, interestingly enough, this is going to be decided by John Roberts. He's the chief of the justice, and he's somebody who has in the past put a lot of faith in stare decisis. That means previous law, that you don't start overturning cases.
Precedents.
So if that is the case, it's going to be very, very interesting to watch. He has gone against some of the conservative code on this, and it'll be interesting to see when this gets to the Supreme Court, how he votes, how he sees it, because he's trying to separate right now the Supreme Court from the executive branch. He's very concerned that it does not become a political football, that it in fact adheres as the third leg of the
There are a lot of maneuvering going on, certainly, among all of these very different but all connected issues in a way. If we want to take a look at the facts, it's important to take a look at the facts too. According to the U.S. Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, there were more than 630,000 abortions performed in the U.S. in the year 2015, a drop by about 14,000 from 2014. After the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973, abortions gradually increased, hitting a peak of around 1.4 million in 1990. The number has declined each year since 2007. Of course, those numbers are just numbers. The question is what the politicians are making use of those numbers. And therefore, I want to go to you once again, Mr. Tangen, about the fact that we are seeing a very heated debate already going on for the next presidential election. Will this be the issue, particularly when this going to the Supreme Court? You have more conservative judges over there, particularly with Brett Kavanaugh, already in line. And remember what he said when he was sworn in, talking about pro-life and many other things. So will this be the biggest issue, probably even preceding being a priority than the others?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the issues have not been set yet.
No.
And if there's criminal behavior or evidence of criminal behavior that's going forward at the state court level where Donald Trump has no control, that will be the single biggest issue. But in terms of emotional issues, yes, definitely. And that's why the Republicans are trying to play this, and it'll be incumbent on the things. Now, I understand that in a rational debate, I agree with my colleague in Washington, this is a very nuanced thing. But that is not the way it's going to be portrayed by the Republicans. They are going to use every trick in the book to try to color this debate, call everybody who's against it a baby killer.
Yeah. And what about Supreme Court?
Supreme Court, very difficult. They're going to have to decide whether they maintain their independence and are part of the checks and balances of a system, or whether they're just political appointees.
Mr. Andrews, very briefly, if you have 1 minute, please also sum up your thoughts.
Yeah, well, what I think is we are at a crossroads. We have an opportunity to make some significant progress. So whether it is a lower court that kicks this Alabama bill back to the Alabama legislature and has them create something different, or whether it's a higher court that maybe kicks it to Congress and has them make some kind of decision. I think we need to figure out a better way to have this discourse and complicate some of these conversations because otherwise we're not going to be able to make progress on them.
Right. Ms. He, final words also from you as a woman observing this issue, of course.
Yeah, I think this is a very unfortunate decision has been made by the Alabama this court. I think when we notice this trend up and down, we will see one of the general rule. That is when the conservative thinking is on the rise, and then this kind of restriction is getting tougher and tougher. But when the liberal thinking is on the rise, and then you will see those abortion numbers also getting rise.
Certainly, the two parties are take advantage of this issue in their different ways. For them, it's the same in a way because it's all become a political topic. Thank you so much for both of you, the three of you, for being with us. He Wenping, Einer Tang, and Brandon Andrews. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, a tale of two ancient civilizations intertwined through space and time, connections of the past to the present with Indian and Chinese scholars. Those interviews right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Next, we turn to Asian civilizations like China. India has had a long history of civilization from the ancient to modern times. The land is the birthplace of two major religions in the world, Hinduism and certainly Buddhism. Buddhist influence is only one of many exchanges between the ancient cultures. In modern time, there have been robust exchanges in film, tourism, and technology. No wonder India sent representatives to China's first ever conference on the dialogue of Asian civilizations in Beijing, which is a new platform for exchanges and mutual understanding among different civilizations. For more, join us in our Beijing studio, Srinath Raghavan, a senior fellow at the Carnegie India. He's also a professor of international relations and history at Ashoka University. What a pleasure seeing you, Professor.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us in Beijing. There are a lot of discussions these days about dialogues among civilizations and across cultures from a country as ancient as India. Professor, what do you make of the significance of this kind of dialogues today?
I think, as you said, both India and China can claim to have a very long civilizational heritage. And what that long civilizational heritage, in effect, symbolizes is the ability to sort of deal with change, is an ability to deal with diversity, is an ability to sort of keep certain forms of identity even while dealing with other forms of plurality. I think all of these are going to be very important characteristics as we think about how we are going to deal with international relations in the 21st century.
But, Professor, if our ancestors managed to do that, it does not necessarily mean that we will be able to do that anyway.
No, not at all. And on the contrary, I think our challenges are many more than our ancestors. I think the pace of change in modern life in the 21st century is so extraordinary. I mean, just the speed with which information travels, with which people are able to understand or misunderstand other cultures, I think is quite extraordinary. So I think the scale of challenges that we have is obviously a lot more. But what I wanted to say in response to your opening point was that these societies and civilizations do give us certain resources, which if we use with the right degree of wisdom, may help us navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Let's talk about these resources. First of all, India and China, both are being termed, quote-unquote, as civilization states, meaning in ancient times, the places we are living in right now were the place where there were ancient civilizations, such as that of the Chinese civilization and the ancient Indian civilization. And yet, we have to make a distinguish here, that is, what we are today is not necessarily an extension of that civilization, but rather quite different, Professor.
Yeah, absolutely true. I think both India and China are modern nation states, but which can claim to have a longer-term civilizational, or call it cultural, sort of a heritage, which is definitely there. And I think what is interesting about both India and China is that these were never sort of closed-off, self-contained civilizations. It was not as if there was no interaction with the rest of the world.
Interesting. Please explain.
Yeah, I mean, I think both India and China were in many ways not civilizations as closed entities, but civilizations as crossroads.
For example, India?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think India has always been a civilization which is really a crossroads, really, where you know, people of different faiths, of different social origins, of different languages have come together. And you know, the entity that we think of as India today is constituted by this kind of diversity of culture. So I would say that, you know, India is a state which has many civilizations in it, and that's always been its strength.
Both China and India are proud of the fact that we can go back in our history, hundreds and probably even thousands of years, to be able to get inspirations. But Professor, as intellectual as you are, you know it's very complicated because sometimes you do not necessarily know who you really are until you really find the most important component of it. Right. And therefore, a rich culture means a lot of resources to tap in, but also means a lot of possibilities to, a lot of myths to rival in a way. So which to choose, what to choose, who exactly we have been, and who should we be for the future? Those are always the questions about identity for countries like India and China when it comes to civilization states.
Absolutely, and I think in some ways, I think the sort of worst option for countries like China and India would be to try and say that there is some kind of essential Chinese and Indian identity that somehow we need to recover, and that is somehow hidden in the past. I don't think that is the case. I think states, peoples make their identities in a continuous fashion. It happens because of engagement with the past, but also with the present, with others. You know, in a sense, I think the formation of identity is something that is a continuous process. And to assume, as you're saying, that, you know, there are some myths out there in the past about either our greatness or our weakness, which should necessarily inform our identity today, would make for a very constricted way of thinking about our heritage in historical, cultural terms.
Srinath Raghavan, what a pleasure to have you on our program today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
States and people define their identities through an ongoing process from the past to the present. That's what the Indian professor tells us. Civilizations are always interacting with one another. Chinese President Xi Jinping did make a point that human civilization had become richer and more colorful through exchanges and mutual learning. In his keynote speech at the opening of the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, I sat down with Wang Hui, a professor of the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in Humanity and Social Sciences. He shares his thoughts about cultural connections as well as how to better know our own culture. China, India, there has been a lot of discussion about how we were connected in the ancient times and what inspirations we can draw from that period of time. But there's one thing I would like to ask you. Exactly how much do we know, really, about our own distinctive cultures?
I remember that many years ago, one of my older friends in China, he made comments. He said that we know that in a long history, India had a huge impact on Chinese civilization, in reshaping the Chinese civilization, mainly because of the Buddhism. But on the other hand, he said that we know very little about what kind of the impact from China over India. But later I came across an Indian friend. He told me that the story of the Xuanzang's visit to India, how his book, the memoirs, and later became the very important documents for reshaping the modern India identity.
Interesting.
So that's the long history that the Indian civilization as a unified civilization during the colonial time. A lot of the Chinese intellectuals, revolutionaries, they work with Indian scholars, intellectuals. We know that in the early years of 20th century, a group of Chinese overseas revolutionaries like Zhang Taiyan, Lu Xun's teacher, who closely work with a group of Indian exile intellectuals in Japan. They create Asian Society for Intimacy, for creating a kind of common identity between Asian countries. Later, we know that Tagore visited Japan and to China and welcomed.
And even to this campus in Tsinghua.
Yes, right, right. And also the Tagore's visit and his discourse on the nationalism and the cultures, let's say, that triggered the debates within the Chinese circles, Chinese intellectual circles. So in that sense, the modern Indian discourse also became part of the Chinese modern discourse. So in that sense, we have a lot of the interactions.
Besides the different periods, sporadic periods, that we know today about how we interacted with one another, is about the fact that how much do we know about our own culture?
No civilization was a pure civilization. All the civilizations was composed by the different traces from other civilizations.
Yes, indeed.
So in that sense, we found that a lot of what we call the Chinese civilization or the Indian civilization, actually each side contained traces of other cultures and civilizations. Buddhism obviously is an example. It's not a single example, but examples. Because we talk about the Chinese Buddhism, we also talk about the certain other, the Japanese or the Tibetan Buddhism, certain kind different. All these Buddhism connected to each other. And also when the Buddhism arrived in Japan or Korea, they have their own.
Take out their own journey. Yes, indeed.
So the different traces connected and localized. Only when we are arriving such a comprehensive diversity, then we can say we have some kind of the self-understanding of our own culture.
That's beautifully said, Professor Wang. On the other hand, there's also another trend that, as you said, as a result of modernity, for example, the Dunhuang grottos in Gansu province, the discovery of that was done by Western explorers to begin with. And then it becomes such an important subject, also linking China and India. But so, Professor Wang, what does that mean for us today if we want to go deeper and more diversify the ways of studying these cultural facts and cultural history?
Actually, these facts itself show that our self-understanding should be defined in its relation to others. So it's not possible to create a pure self-understanding or the self-conceptualization of our own image or of our own identity. Especially the modern knowledge was really deeply shaped by the Western knowledge. So for example, we used to say the Asian civilization. But what is the Asian civilization? The idea of Asia itself was the invention of the Western knowledge.
Yes, indeed.
So and that, in that sense, this idea of Asia was always in the binary relations between Asia and Europe. That kind of binary itself reduced the importance of complexity within the category of Asia. We know that almost all the religions, major religions, was originated in these regions. Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, different kind of religions really came from here. But when you talk about the Asia and the Europe, obviously try to use the Christian Europe to contrast to others, so that they created the otherness to the Europe. Then, ironically, sometimes that the otherness became our self-identity. So in that sense, we need to go
unconsciously
break up that kind of the simplified the identity to reach a new identity.
We see developing countries, emerging economies, China, India very much included, over the past decade during its economic pickup, tried very hard to create certain kind of common identity. However, besides decolonialization, besides the fast economic development, besides their common consensus to provide complementary roles to the current international system, there seems to be a lack of values that they would identify together throughout times.
Mm-hmm. First of all, you're right that on the one hand, we have such a long history, profound history, but on the other hand, our observations each other was shaped by there's a third eye.
Yes, indeed.
To see that after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, so many the projects went. You know that the 10+1,
yes.
10+3, and so on and so forth, and Shanghai 6, and all these projects was now ongoing, continues ongoing for these. So the regionalization at the same time is a response to the globalization and also a form of globalization in this region. But from the beginning, we know that the diversities. So that's why the people really try to think about whether or not we can create a network rather than a totality. Mm-hmm. Like not a superstate,
yes.
but a kind of the network. A network being that the focus on the interconnectivities, not create a superstate structure. This is the first. Second, which also means that the deep understanding of the mutual recognition of the sovereignty to some. That sovereignty is not simply normative idea of European international law, but the political results of the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial process. So that's, I think, from 19th, 20th century, both India, South Asia, or the whole regions, they know that how difficult for those countries achieve their autonomy. So in that sense, a network in cooperation is inevitable, but on the other hand, create a kind of the sense of the mutual respect, the mutual recognition.
2 decades ago, something like Clash of Civilization has mainly attracted people's eyeballs.
Yes.
And recently, it is something called the Thucydides trap, which is about rising power, incumbent power. Now, some have pointed out there are certain kinds of common grounds between these two theories. Earlier, you said something coming from developing countries, for example, that is totally different. But the question really is whether the idea will become reality. The aspiration will be translated into everyday practices.
We know that the civilization contains different components of cultures itself. But on the other hand, because of this long process of racialization of that category, we used to understand the civilization almost as a unit of the nation to some extent,
right.
or the certain kind of the races. So that's the historical legacies. We need to reconsider it, to find our own category or redefine it in the historical relations. That's the issue. The second, everyday life was so many. A civilization, on the one hand, is a huge entity, but on the other hand, there could be a very concrete lifestyle. When I visit Tibetan areas in Yunnan, the Dechen areas, one of my friends, his family were composed of the 4 ethnicities. The one family, 4 ethnicities.
Under one roof.
Yes, under one roof. So it's a symbol that we need to pay our attention to these kind of the everyday social life. But we need to retrieve this kind of the everyday life, so vivid and rich everyday life, to categorize it, to conceptualize it. And then that could give us another orientation to think about the world. So on the one hand, we need to learn from the history for the reality, but on the other hand, we also need to create kind of the more clearer the future to reshape our knowledge about our past, because our past also been summarized into a narrow-minded way of thinking. So in that sense, I also mentioned that the rethinking of Asian history is a process of the recreation or the remaking of the world history.
That is Wang Hui, a widely respected historian from China. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world.